The Ardennes Forest. December 1944. Snow fell in heavy silence, muffling the thunder of distant artillery. Beneath the towering fir trees, American soldiers huddled in their foxholes, cold, hungry, and exhausted. Their breath froze instantly in the air, their boots caked with ice, their fingers numb on the triggers of rifles they barely had the strength to hold. Bastogne, a small Belgian crossroads town, had become the center of their world. Around them, German divisions pressed closer, cutting off every road, every path, every escape. Ammunition was running out. Medical supplies were nearly gone. Rations were reduced to scraps. And the sky, their only lifeline for resupply, remained sealed by thick winter storms. The men of the 101st Airborne Division, paratroopers who had already fought through Normandy and Holland, now faced a nightmare none of them had imagined. They were surrounded, outnumbered, and exposed to one of the harshest winters in European memory. And as the days passed, the laughter of their enemies echoed through the frozen forest. German officers mocked the soft Americans. "The Yankees have no stomach for the cold," they said. "They are city boys. They will break." Around campfires, Wehrmacht and SS troops joked that it was only a matter of days before the Americans, shivering in their foxholes, would raise their hands and surrender. After all, why would they keep fighting in such hopeless conditions? But deep inside Bastogne, among the snow-covered ruins and makeshift aid stations, the Americans refused to collapse. There were no warm barracks, no roaring fires, no guarantees of survival. Only a stubborn determination, an unshakable will, and a fierce pride that echoed in every whispered conversation. "We hold here, or we die here." Far to the south, another figure watched the battle unfold with burning intensity. General George S. Patton, brash, ruthless, and relentless, was not a man who tolerated defeat. As news of Bastogne's plight reached him, he demanded the impossible from his staff. In the dead of winter, with snow clogging the roads and ice stiffening the ground, he ordered his Third Army to turn north, to break through the German lines, and to rescue the surrounded paratroopers. It was madness, many thought. Moving an entire army in such conditions was a feat of planning that normally took weeks, not days. But Patton was determined. His tanks would roll through the blizzard, or not at all. Meanwhile, the Germans tightened the noose around Bastogne. Every day, artillery pounded the town. Every night, infiltrators probed American lines. Soldiers in frozen foxholes stared across the snow, waiting for the final assault that seemed inevitable. They knew what the Germans expected: panic, surrender, collapse. And truth be told, many wondered how much longer they could endure. But the laughter of the enemy only hardened their resolve. What the Germans did not know was that Patton's tanks were already moving, creeping north through snow-choked valleys, across icy ridges, and past villages reduced to rubble. Men and machines strained against nature itself, fighting not just the enemy, but the blizzard that threatened to halt them at every turn. Inside Bastogne, hope flickered faintly. Would relief come? Or would they be left to their fate, a tragic footnote in a brutal war? The Germans believed they had already won. They mocked the Americans as weak, pampered, and ill-prepared for true hardship. They laughed at the sight of frostbitten soldiers and dwindling supplies. But soon, very soon, that laughter would freeze on their lips. Because through the snow, through the storm, through the impossible, Patton's tanks were coming. And when they arrived, history itself would turn. By the closing months of 1944, the war in Europe seemed all but decided. Allied armies had stormed ashore in Normandy the previous June, broken out of the beachheads, and swept across France in a lightning advance. Paris had been liberated, Antwerp captured, and German forces pushed back toward their own borders. In London and Washington, many dared to hope that the war would be over by Christmas. But Adolf Hitler had one last card to play. In the heart of the Ardennes, a region of dense forests and rolling hills, he conceived a desperate counteroffensive. His generals were skeptical, his armies were exhausted, and his fuel supplies were critically low. Yet Hitler gambled everything on a bold plan to smash through thinly defended American lines, drive all the way to Antwerp, and split the Allied armies in two. If successful, he hoped, this blow would shatter Allied morale, force a negotiated peace in the West, and allow him to turn back against the Soviets in the East. The target chosen for this offensive was not random. The Ardennes had been quiet for months. Allied commanders considered it a rest sector, where tired divisions could recuperate. Defenses were light, reconnaissance limited. No one expected a massive assault here. That was precisely why Hitler chose it. On December 16, 1944, under cover of thick fog and blizzard conditions, the German army struck with a ferocity that stunned the Allies. Panzer divisions roared out of the forest. Infantry swarmed through American positions. Entire units were overrun, cut off, or sent fleeing in chaos. The Americans called it the Battle of the Bulge, for the deep protrusion the German advance carved into the Allied front lines. But for the men on the ground, there was nothing abstract about it. It was the largest battle the U.S. Army would fight in World War II. More than 1 million men ultimately engaged, with terrible losses on both sides. At the center of this unfolding storm lay a small Belgian market town, Bastogne. Bastogne was not remarkable in size or beauty, but its position was everything. 7 major roads converged there, like spokes on a wheel. Control Bastogne, and you controlled movement through the Ardennes. Lose it, and the German offensive could roll unchecked toward Antwerp. That was why, as German columns poured into Belgium, Bastogne became the focal point of the fight. The Germans understood this perfectly. Their armored spearheads raced to capture the crossroads. But when they arrived, they found American paratroopers already there. The 101st Airborne Division, some of the most battle-hardened troops in the U.S. Army, had been rushed in at the last moment, alongside elements of the 10th Armored Division and other scattered units. Together, they dug in, vowing to hold the town no matter what. The German High Command looked on the situation with contempt. To them, the Americans were still a new army, well-equipped, yes, but inexperienced, soft, and reliant on comforts. German propaganda painted the GIS as spoiled amateurs, incapable of withstanding the hardships that hardened Wehrmacht veterans had endured on the Eastern Front. To German officers, Bastogne was a trap of the Americans' own making. Surrounded, outgunned, cut off from supply, how long could they possibly last? Days? A week? Surely not longer. What they underestimated was not American weaponry, or even American numbers, but the resilience of the men themselves. The soldiers who crouched in foxholes around Bastogne were not naive farm boys or pampered city kids. They were veterans of Normandy, survivors of Holland, fighters who had seen friends fall in battles turn on grit alone. They knew Bastogne mattered. They knew surrender was not an option. And somewhere behind them, an even greater force stirred. George S. Patton, brilliant, volatile, and often controversial, had been waiting for just such an opportunity. To him, Bastogne was not a disaster in the making. It was a challenge, a test of will, a chance to prove the speed and power of his beloved Third Army. As the snow thickened and the German noose tightened, 2 worlds faced each other across the frozen forests. On one side, German commanders certain of American weakness. On the other, American soldiers determined to prove them wrong, holding out against all odds, praying for relief. And in the south, engines rumbled. Patton was already moving. The German offensive crashed into the American lines with brutal speed on the morning of December 16, 1944. At first, many U.S. soldiers thought the artillery bombardment was just another local skirmish. After all, the Ardennes had been considered a quiet sector, an area to rest and rebuild after the savage fighting in France. But within hours, the truth became clear. This was no minor clash. It was a storm. German shells rained down on towns and crossroads, tearing apart communications lines and sowing chaos. Out of the mist and snow emerged waves of German infantry, followed by the dreaded panzers, steel monsters grinding forward through villages, their treads crushing ice and stone alike. American outposts, caught off guard, crumbled. Entire companies disappeared under the onslaught. For the Germans, it was the surprise they had hoped for. For the Americans, it was a nightmare. Soldiers fled through the woods in disarray. Retreats turned into desperate defenses. Roads jammed with vehicles trying to escape as German armor pressed forward. At Bastogne, the alarm sounded quickly. The crossroads town was suddenly thrust from backwater obscurity into the center of the storm. High Command rushed to act. The 101st Airborne Division, resting near Reims, was ordered to move fast. They had no time to prepare, no chance to gather proper supplies. Trucks roared through the night, crammed with paratroopers still wearing light clothing from their last mission. Many had no winter boots, no gloves, no heavy coats. They would be asked to fight in the bitter cold of the Ardennes with gear better suited for autumn. When they arrived, the men of the 101st dug in with practiced efficiency. Foxholes were hacked into frozen ground, each strike of the entrenching tool sparking against the ice. Machine gun nests were set up along the tree lines. Artillery batteries were positioned to cover the approaches. Scattered elements of the 10th Armored Division joined them, as well as engineers, clerks, and stray units pulled into the defense. It was a patchwork army, but its mission was clear: hold Bastogne. By December 20th, the Germans had completed their encirclement. Bastogne was surrounded. Every road in and out was in enemy hands. The trap had closed. Inside the perimeter, the Americans prepared for a siege. They counted their ammunition and rations. There was little of either. Medical supplies were scarce, and casualties were already mounting from constant artillery fire. In makeshift aid stations, often just barns or cellars, medics worked frantically, wrapping wounds with torn bedsheets, melting snow for water, and whispering reassurances they didn't always believe. The cold was relentless. Temperatures plunged well below freezing. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Weapons jammed in the ice. Soldiers huddled together in their foxholes for warmth, listening to the whine of incoming shells. Nights were the worst. Long hours of shivering in the dark, ears straining for the sound of German movement in the trees. And yet, in the midst of this misery, humor survived. Soldiers joked about their freezing foxhole resort. Others quipped that if they ever made it home, they'd never complain about summer heat again. It was gallows humor, born of desperation, but it kept spirits alive. The Germans, for their part, mocked the Americans openly. Wehrmacht soldiers jeered that the cowboys were finished. Prisoners of war, captured in the early days of the offensive, were paraded past Bastogne's defenders as proof of the inevitability of surrender. German commanders were certain. These pampered Americans could not withstand both their firepower and the merciless winter. But the paratroopers had other ideas. Foxholes became fortresses. Every tree line, every hedgerow, every ruined farmhouse was turned into a defensive position. Machine gun teams braced themselves for waves of German infantry. Bazooka crews lay in wait for the next panzer to emerge from the mist. Artillerymen, short on shells, fired only when absolutely certain of their targets. Each explosion shook the frozen ground, echoing through the forest like thunder. The first German assaults were ferocious. Infantry surged across snowy fields, their silhouettes stark against the white landscape. Tanks followed close behind, their guns spitting fire. The Americans met them with everything they had. Mortars burst among advancing troops. Anti-tank rounds slammed into armored hulls. Paratroopers rose from foxholes, firing rifles and machine guns until barrels steamed. Again and again, the Germans were beaten back. For the men inside Bastogne, each successful defense brought relief, but also dread. Ammunition was dwindling. Every bullet fired was one less for tomorrow. Every shell spent was irreplaceable, and the Germans kept coming. Meanwhile, the wounded piled up. Aid stations overflowed. Doctors performed amputations with little more than morphine and determination. Bandages were reused, cleaned in melted snow. Chaplains moved among the wounded, offering prayers, comfort, or simply holding hands until the end. Still, the defenders endured. One paratrooper later recalled, "We were freezing, hungry, and scared. But we weren't going to let the Germans take Bastogne. Not while we were still breathing." That spirit became the invisible wall around the town. The Germans might have had more men, more tanks, and more artillery, but the Americans had resolve. Yet as the siege dragged on, one question loomed larger with every passing day. How long could they hold? Supplies were almost gone. The skies, thick with snow and fog, grounded Allied aircraft. Relief seemed impossible. The Germans laughed at the thought of American stubbornness. Surely, they said, it was only a matter of time before desperation forced surrender. But Bastogne was not just another town. To the Allies, it was a symbol, a hinge upon which the entire battle turned. Lose it, and the German advance might yet succeed. Hold it, and the offensive could be blunted. The defenders of Bastogne did not know it yet, but their stand was buying precious time. Time for the Allies to regroup. Time for commanders to plan. Time for one man, far to the south, to prepare his army for a march that would defy the very laws of logistics. George S. Patton was watching, and he was already moving the pieces of a rescue that would shock the world. By late December 1944, Bastogne had become a frozen hell. The defenders' situation grew more desperate by the hour. Ammunition belts were nearly empty. Food was scarce. Soldiers gnawed at cold rations or chewed on frozen bread too hard for teeth to break. Medical supplies had run out. Morphine was rationed drop by drop. The wounded lay on straw, shivering under thin blankets, listening to the distant thump of artillery that promised more would soon join them. The sky remained the cruelest enemy. Low, heavy clouds blotted out the sun and sealed off hope of resupply. For days, Allied aircraft, those vital lifelines, were grounded. No food, no ammunition, no bandages, just the endless gray above, as if the heavens themselves had abandoned the defenders. The Germans sensed victory. Commanders of the encircling panzer divisions were convinced the Americans would soon collapse. The laughter that drifted from their lines was not just mockery, but certainty. They cannot last much longer, one German officer was overheard saying. The snow, the hunger, it will finish them before we do. On December 22nd, the Germans decided to offer what they believed was a merciful way out. A small delegation under a white flag approached Bastogne. They carried a typed message addressed to the American commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, who was serving as acting commander of the 101st Airborne. The note demanded the honorable surrender of Bastogne, warning that refusal would result in total annihilation. McAuliffe read the message, shook his head, and chuckled. "They want us to surrender?" he asked incredulously. His staff looked on, waiting for his response. McAuliffe, still smiling, scrawled a single word. Nuts. The word puzzled the German envoys when they received it. Confused, they asked for clarification. An American officer explained bluntly, "It means, go to hell." The defiance electrified the defenders. Word of McAuliffe's reply spread through the foxholes and aid stations like wildfire. Soldiers laughed for the first time in days. Nuts became a battle cry, a symbol of their refusal to bow. In that single word, McAuliffe had captured the stubborn spirit of Bastogne. But defiance alone could not stop the shells. The bombardment resumed, heavier than ever. German artillery pounded the town relentlessly. Trees exploded into splinters. Buildings collapsed into rubble. Roads became impassable, churned into icy craters. And still, the infantry attacks continued, probing, pressing, testing the thin American lines. Inside Bastogne, every man was stretched to the limit. Machine gunners counted bullets one by one. Bazooka crews waited until tanks were nearly on top of them before firing, to be sure not a single rocket was wasted. Men fought with frostbitten hands, bloodied faces, and empty stomachs. Yet they held. Psychological strain gnawed at everyone. Nights were filled with the cries of the wounded, the groan of artillery, and the whistle of shells overhead. In the dark, soldiers imagined German infiltrators creeping through the snow. Some confessed later that they feared the cold more than the bullets. It was an enemy that never stopped attacking, even in silence. And yet, amid the despair, there was faith. Faith in relief. Faith in their comrades. Faith in the belief that America would not abandon them. That faith rested on the shoulders of one man, George S. Patton. Patton was in Lorraine when the German offensive erupted. His Third Army had been preparing to push into the Saar region. But when Eisenhower realized the scale of the Ardennes attack, he turned to Patton. Could the Third Army pivot north, strike into the Bulge, and relieve Bastogne? Most generals would have hesitated. The logistical challenge alone was staggering. An entire army, divisions of men, tanks, artillery, and supplies, would need to turn 90 degrees and move through snow-choked roads within days. It was a task planners said required weeks. Patton didn't hesitate. He had already prepared for such a possibility, keeping contingency plans ready. When Eisenhower asked how quickly he could attack north, Patton stunned the room by answering, "In 48 hours." Those who knew him were not surprised. Patton thrived on the impossible. His soldiers called him old blood and guts, a man who demanded speed, aggression, and relentless attack. He believed in momentum above all else. Never let the enemy recover. Never give them time to breathe. And so, while Bastogne froze, Patton's Third Army turned. Columns of tanks roared to life, their engines sputtering in the cold. Supply convoys followed, chains clattering on icy roads. Infantry marched through snowdrifts, packs heavy on their shoulders, breath steaming in the frozen air. It was not just a maneuver. It was a miracle of organization, a testament to American logistics and discipline. Meanwhile, back inside Bastogne, the defenders endured wave after wave of assaults. On Christmas Eve, German paratroopers attempted a night attack. Flashes of gunfire lit the darkness, the sounds of shouting echoing through the woods. The Americans beat them back once more, but exhaustion was written on every face. Then, on Christmas morning, the skies cleared. For the first time in days, sunlight pierced the clouds. The roar of aircraft engines filled the air, not German bombers, but American C-47s. Parachutes blossomed above the town, carrying crates of ammunition, food, and medical supplies. Men cheered, some with tears freezing on their cheeks, as the precious bundles landed across the snow. The resupply bought them time, but they all knew it wasn't enough. Relief had to come from the ground. And somewhere to the south, Patton's tanks were pushing northward, battling blizzards, mines, and ambushes, forcing a path toward Bastogne. The Germans, still mocking the Americans, had no idea what was coming. Their confidence remained high. They believed the trap was unbreakable, that Bastogne would be their prize, a symbol of German resurgence. But the laughter would not last, because Patton's Third Army was closing in. And when steel met snow, the arrogance of the German command would shatter. South of Bastogne, roads clogged with columns of tanks, trucks, and infantry. Patton's Third Army, tens of thousands of men and machines, was in motion. Snow lashed their faces, ice gripped the tires, and enemy patrols harassed their flanks. Yet nothing stopped the advance. To Patton, speed was survival. Every wasted hour meant another soldier freezing in Bastogne, another chance for the Germans to overwhelm the defenders. The task was staggering. To pivot an entire army 90 degrees in mid-campaign was almost unheard of. Staff officers worked around the clock, redirecting traffic, mapping routes, and rationing fuel. Supply depots shifted. Engineers cleared roads buried in snow. Convoys snaked north, headlights dimmed to slits against the icy wind. It was war as much against nature as the Wehrmacht. And still, the Germans mocked. From their perspective, the Americans were already beaten. Diaries from German soldiers at the time often speak with scorn about cowboys who fought well in fair weather but would collapse in the cold. Captured American prisoners were interrogated harshly, and their frostbitten hands and hollow cheeks were pointed to as proof that the rest inside Bastogne could not last. Yet as days passed, cracks began to show in the German confidence. Their timetable had been built on speed, swift capture of Bastogne, rapid advance to the Meuse, then on to Antwerp. But Bastogne refused to fall. Every assault, no matter how fierce, was thrown back. Panzer commanders reported mounting losses. Infantry complained of being mowed down by stubborn machine gun fire. What was supposed to be a simple encirclement was turning into a costly siege. One German officer later admitted, "We thought the Americans would surrender in 2 days. When they did not, we realized something was wrong. These men fought like devils." Inside Bastogne, morale seesawed between despair and defiance. The December 23rd airdrops had brought desperately needed supplies. Ammunition was replenished. Crates of food and medicine lifted spirits. Some soldiers even managed a crude Christmas meal, cold rations eaten by candlelight in a cellar while shells pounded above. Chaplains led prayers, their words echoing in half-ruined churches. But the siege was far from over. The wounded still suffered horribly. Frostbite cases mounted. Soldiers wrapped their feet in burlap, rubbed them with axle grease. Anything to stave off the blackening of skin. Aid stations overflowed with men who had lost fingers, toes, or more. And still, the line held. Stories from foxholes became legends. A single machine gun crew holding a crossroad against repeated attacks. A medic crawling through shellfire to reach a wounded comrade. Paratroopers joking, even as shells burst nearby, that the Krauts picked the wrong bunch of guys to mess with. These moments, small in scale, stitched together the larger story of Bastogne. Ordinary men doing extraordinary things. Meanwhile, Patton's tanks pressed forward. The terrain slowed them. Snowdrifts buried the roads, and German rearguards fought delaying actions. Mines detonated under treads, ambushes flared in villages, artillery fell on columns inching forward. But the Third Army refused to stop. Patton himself drove his commanders mercilessly. He demanded updates constantly, berated delays, and pushed for speed at any cost. His men cursed him under their breath, yet also drew strength from his audacity. They knew he would not rest until Bastogne was reached. The Germans began to realize their situation was shifting. Reports flowed into their headquarters. American armor advancing from the south, skies clearing again for Allied aircraft, and Bastogne still in enemy hands. The laughter quieted. Mockery turned to frustration. One German prisoner captured later confessed, "We had been told the Americans would crumble, but they did not. Instead, it was we who began to fear." The power of American logistics was now on full display. While German supply lines stretched thin, starved of fuel and ammunition, the Americans seemed to conjure resources from nowhere. Convoys of trucks kept Patton's tanks moving. Airdrops sustained the defenders in Bastogne. Coordination between ground and air units, though strained, was relentless. For German soldiers, used to shortages and rationing, the sight of Americans still fighting, still supplied, was unnerving. They had expected to see weakness. Instead, they saw a machine that refused to break. By December 24th, the German high command was growing uneasy. Bastogne had become a thorn in their side, delaying the advance and consuming precious divisions. They threw more troops into the fight, desperate to break the pocket before Patton's arrival. The attacks became furious, concentrated, and bloody. But the defenders had grown hardened. Every assault was met with withering fire. The town's perimeter contracted slightly under pressure, but the line never snapped. Even when tanks penetrated close to the outskirts, bazooka teams hunted them down, destroying them at point-blank range. And then, on December 25th, Christmas Day, American aircraft again filled the skies. Fighters strafed German positions, bombers shattered concentrations of troops, and more supply drops landed within Bastogne. To the soldiers huddled in foxholes, the sight of parachutes drifting down in the winter sun felt like a miracle. Some wrote in diaries that it was the best Christmas gift imaginable. The Germans, by contrast, began to feel the weight of inevitability. Their offensive was slowing. Fuel shortages crippled their tanks. Morale faltered as casualties mounted, and Bastogne still defied them. The once loud laughter had quieted into grim silence. One by one, German soldiers began to realize the truth. The Americans were not the weaklings they had been told. They were relentless, stubborn, and supplied by an industrial machine that seemed endless. The myth of American softness shattered in the snows of Bastogne. As Christmas passed, the defenders' radios crackled with news. Patton's Third Army was near. Relief was coming. Tanks were pushing closer, mile by mile, through the snow and the fight. For the men in Bastogne, hope became something tangible. They could almost hear the rumble of engines in the distance. For the Germans, the laughter was gone. What remained was dread. Because Patton's tanks were no longer just moving, they were nearly there. December 26, 1944. Snow still blanketed the fields, but the skies above were clear, pale blue over the ruined Ardennes. Inside Bastogne, the defenders clung to their positions, exhausted beyond words. For nearly a week they had fought without rest, cold, hungry, and battered by relentless attacks. No man dared to hope too much. Relief had been promised before. Rumors of tanks coming had circulated for days, but nothing had broken the siege. Not yet. And then, faint at first, came a sound unlike any other. A low, steady rumble carried through the frozen air. Men raised their heads, ears straining. Some thought it was German armor preparing another assault. Others feared it was imagination, born of desperation. But the sound grew louder, stronger, distinct. It was the growl of engines, the unmistakable thunder of American tanks. On the southern perimeter of Bastogne, at the village of Assinois, scouts peered through the trees and saw them at last. Shermans, dusted with snow, pushing forward through German fire. Behind them came half-tracks and infantry, advancing yard by yard, blasting through resistance. It was the lead elements of Patton's Third Army, the 4th Armored Division, fighting their way to Bastogne. Inside the encircled town, men cheered, shouted, even wept openly. Some climbed from their foxholes despite the danger, waving arms, firing rifles into the air in joy. After days of silence and despair, the sight of those tanks was salvation made real. The Germans, too, saw, and their reaction was far different. Where once there had been confidence and laughter, now there was shock and fear. The unbreakable ring they had promised their commanders was shattered before their eyes. The Americans had done the impossible. The 4th Armored Division had driven through snow, ice, and determined German defenses. It had battled ambushes, minefields, and artillery. And still it had come. One officer later said simply, "We knew those boys in Bastogne were counting on us. We weren't about to let them down." When the lead Sherman finally rolled into the town, battered paratroopers swarmed around it. Filthy, unshaven, eyes hollow from exhaustion, they slapped the steel hulls and grinned through cracked lips. "You're a sight for sore eyes," one shouted. Tankers handed out cigarettes, rations, and chocolate. For a moment, the war itself seemed suspended. Relief had arrived. But this was more than a tactical victory. It was a turning point. For the Germans, Bastogne had been the linchpin of their grand offensive. Capturing it would have opened roads to the Meuse, threatening Antwerp and splitting the Allies. Failing to take it meant their timetable collapsed, their momentum blunted. With Patton's breakthrough, the initiative shifted irreversibly back to the Allies. The laughter that had echoed in German camps at the start of the siege was now gone. In its place came silence, grim recognition that the offensive was faltering. Their gamble had failed. For the Americans, the relief of Bastogne became a legend almost instantly. Newspapers back home trumpeted the story of surrounded paratroopers defying German surrender demands with nuts and holding out until Patton's tanks broke through. Soldiers spoke of it with pride for decades to come, remembering not just the victory, but the brotherhood forged in suffering. General Patton, for his part, called it one of his proudest achievements. He had promised to relieve Bastogne in days, and he had delivered. His army's maneuver became a textbook example of speed, logistics, and determination. And for the men inside Bastogne, survival was its own reward. They had endured the cold, the hunger, the bombardment, and the fear. They had heard the enemy's mocking laughter and answered it with defiance. And when salvation came, it proved beyond doubt that they were not abandoned, not forgotten. In the snow-covered Ardennes, the myth of American weakness died. The siege of Bastogne was more than a battle. It was a crucible, a test of endurance, courage, and resolve. In that frozen Belgian town, surrounded by enemy forces and battered by the harshest winter in living memory, American soldiers defied not just the German army, but also the expectations of a world that doubted them. At the beginning of the siege, German officers mocked their opponents. They laughed at the thought of Americans surviving without supplies, without comfort, without warmth. They expected surrender. They expected collapse. To them, the GI was soft, untested, and incapable of enduring true hardship. But the laughter did not last. Instead, the world witnessed a different story, one of resilience in the face of despair. Soldiers with frostbitten hands still pulled triggers. Medics without proper supplies still saved lives. Commanders who could have surrendered instead wrote "nuts" on a piece of paper, and in that single word, embodied the spirit of defiance. And then, through the snow, came Patton's tanks, living proof of American power, ingenuity, and determination. The Third Army's dash to Bastogne was more than a tactical maneuver. It was a symbol. It showed that America's strength did not lie only in its weapons or its machines, but in the willpower to act quickly, decisively, and relentlessly, even when the odds seemed impossible. For the Germans, Bastogne marked the beginning of the end. The failure to capture the crossroads doomed their Ardennes offensive. The push toward Antwerp stalled. The last gamble of Hitler's Reich collapsed under the weight of American stubbornness and Allied coordination. From that point forward, the German army would be on the defensive, retreating back toward its own borders until the final surrender in May 1945. For the Americans, Bastogne became a legend. Veterans carried the memory of the siege for the rest of their lives. They spoke of the cold, the hunger, the fear, and the pride. Pride in having endured when surrender would have been easier. Pride in having stood firm until help arrived. Pride in proving to the world, and to themselves, that they could withstand the worst the enemy could throw at them. The meaning of Bastogne echoes beyond the battlefield. It is a story of how resolve can defy expectation, how unity can withstand isolation, and how laughter at one's weakness can turn to silence before one's strength. Today, visitors to Bastogne walk among memorials and museums, where the echoes of that frozen December still linger. The fields and forests are quiet now, but beneath the snow lies the memory of men who fought, suffered, and refused to break. The Germans laughed at the Americans, believing the siege would end in humiliation. Instead, it ended in triumph. Bastogne became not a symbol of defeat, but of resilience. Not of surrender, but of endurance. And as Patton's tanks rolled into the town, clattering through the snow, they did more than relieve a besieged garrison. They wrote a chapter in history, a chapter that reminds us that even in the darkest winter, courage can prevail and laughter can give way to silence. The Battle of Bastogne was not the end of the war. Fierce fighting still lay ahead, across the Rhine, into the heart of Germany, and to the final collapse of the Reich. But the spirit forged in those frozen foxholes would carry the Allies forward. It proved that America could endure, that its soldiers could fight as hard and suffer as much as any army in the world. And it left a message, carved into history by fire and ice. When underestimated, when mocked, when surrounded and nearly broken, resilience can turn despair into victory. Bastogne stands as proof.